Now what we're going to do here is begin by starting to understand basically the structure of the Bible. How is it put together according to genre? Because that's one of the most important things we can do is we begin to show people how to understand their Bible. And so in this video, I'm going to talk about basically what is the structure of the Bible, what is the genre of it, of the Old and New Testament, so we begin to understand that. And then as we unpack that, we then, in the next video, will begin to talk about the meta-narrative or the larger story of the Old and New Testaments and how they connect. If you do these two simple things, you would be amazed at how much that would open the Bible for people. Because so much of the reason why people do not read their Bible or lack the confidence to is they just don't know, what am I reading? So they look at it like, I'm confused, I don't understand. Maybe they were like me as I was like in college, 21, 22 years old, and I decided, you know what, I'm going to read the Bible. I desire to learn it. I want to learn it. I'm in a Bible study. Let's do it. So I said, I'm going to read in Genesis. I'm going to read it all the way to Revelation because that's what smart people do. And so I started in Genesis, just trucking along, got through the 50 chapters. Woo! That was a lot, but I'm in. So I went on into Exodus. It was looking pretty good. They got chapter 20 or so and 10 Commandments. Hey, I've heard of those, all right? And then keep going, and then it was just like, okay, portable tabernacle. How do I build one of those? Oh, great, Ark of the Covenant. Yeah, I saw that in Indiana Jones. That's great. I love knowing the sizes of the boards that I need to use. And I just began to slow down, and I began to lose the energy that I had. But I was committed to this, because I'm stubborn, and I'm one of those committed types. And so I pushed on into Leviticus, and I just died. Because after about 7 chapters, 6 of which were dealing with various types of sacrifices for sin, I was so confused and so worn out. It was like chewing sand. That I remember just putting my Bible, dropping it on the floor and saying, that's it, done. I'm done. I can't do anymore. I don't understand this at all. And so I just kind of gave up on trying to understand basically the story of the Bible. And here's the thing, I know I'm not alone. I know a lot of people who were even more stubborn than me, and they kept going, and guess what? They might have made it even past Leviticus and past Numbers and Deuteronomy. Woo! Into Joshua and Judges, but then guess what? At some point, everybody's got to hit the prophets. You get to Jeremiah and Isaiah, and you're like, well, hold on, where do these guys fit in? Because it's story, but I just don't understand, and we get lost. And it wasn't until a year out of college, there was a pastor who would meet with a handful of us in the morning to teach us the Bible, and he began to unpack the structure of the Bible. And when he did, it was like a light went on, and I realized, that's it. That's what, why hadn't anybody told me this? Why hadn't they done this? And I was just like, I was so frustrated. I was like, why did I have to wait till now? Into kind of this discipleship time with this pastor to learn this. Why had no one taught me? And I know this wasn't like people out to get me or anything, but it just confused me. And so in my time with people, that's one of the first things I go over with them in explaining the Bible is I want them to understand the structure. I want them to understand how it's set up, because once they do, it begins to make a lot of sense. And in fact, I made one of these cards and I included it. You can get a link to it. It's really simple. I just created this, and I can't take credit for it because someone else did it, and I just saw something like it and tweaked it a little bit, where I break down in it basically, these are your historical books of the Old Testament, starting in Genesis, ending in Nehemiah. And guess what? The rest of your Old Testament books fit in here in some form or fashion. And then you have the intertestamental period, so the 420 years that occurred between the end historically of your Old Testament and your New Testament. Here's your New Testament books, and seeing how they break down. And this simple card, which someone gave to me, I have used countless times to help people understand the basics so they see what's going on. Because, again, it reminds me of Vince Lombardi, the head coach of the Green Bay Packers, whose name is on the Lombardi trophy that they hand out at the Super Bowl for the winner. I mean, they named it after him. He would start off every training camp with the basics, and first by holding up a football and saying, gentlemen, this is a football. And I'm sure the older players just rolled their eyes and was like, okay, we get it, Vince, we understand. But he went over basics. Why? Because if you do the basics well, the complicated stuff makes a lot more sense. If you do the basics well, you can have categories for the complex stuff. And so let's get to the basics of it. So, we have the issue of genre. I can't spell all of a sudden. Genres of the, or categories of literature for both the Old and New Testament. And so what I'm going to start off with is the Old Testament. There are three categories. There is historical, poetical, and prophetical. Okay? And what kind of literature should we expect to find in historical? Well, history. Makes sense? All right. What about poetical? What kind of literature should we expect? Oh, poetry. Okay. And in prophetical, prophecy. Now this isn't like gloom and doom, the world's going to end on May 21st or whenever that was. Okay, this is talking mainly about God's covenantal relationship with His people, saying, if you do not follow me, if you do not listen, these things will happen to you. And we'll go into a little bit more of what prophetical literature actually is. Here's the interesting thing. This is your Old Testament broken down by genre. Simple as that. Now, side note, is there just poetry in the poetical literature? No. Okay? There is some historical, there are some narrative spots. Job, for example, 2 chapters of narrative, follow about 38 of, actually followed, the next 38 chapters are poetry, and then closing out with one more chapter of narrative. Okay? Even there was narrative in prophetical literature, like the book of Jonah is all prophetic, is all narrative. This is telling the story of Jonah, but Jonah was a prophet, and so it's put in the prophetical section. By the way, was there prophetical announcements in the historical books? Yes. Okay. Is there poetry in the historical and prophetical books? Yes. They kind of mix with each other. But these are good fixed categories to understanding your Old Testament. So let's actually dive in and talk about what those actually are. Starting with the historical. Okay. Your historical genre is going to start in Genesis, and it's going to end down in Nehemiah, all right, which I'm going to explain here in just a minute. Some of you are like, well, hold on, what about Esther? I'll get to that. Now, this basically, your Old Testament, is roughly 2,500 plus years at the very minimum. It's a long chunk of time. That's why there's a lot of books here. So we got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah. These are your Old Testament books. 2,500 plus years in regards to those. But you're like, well, that's great. All right, so hold on. You mean it stops at Nehemiah? Yes, it does. And as you can see maybe from this card, we begin at Genesis, we finish at Nehemiah, and then after Nehemiah, we have 420 years until John the Baptist shows up. And this is known as the silent period, where God is still very much active, still doing things, but He's silent. He's not speaking any new revelation, anything like that. And these 420 years is also known as the intertestamental period, the period between the testaments. That is your Old Testament right there. Now, all your other books are going to fit in somewhere along this timeline, and that's what I'm going to talk about right now. Now, speaking of the historical books, Genesis, we've got creation, Adam, Eve, Noah, patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Boom! They end the end of Genesis in Egypt, being taken care of by Joseph, who's second in command of Egypt. And it's in Exodus that they're enslaved, and that's where Moses finds them. And so God says, no, we're not going to leave them there. And he allows Moses, by his power, to lead the people out and to take them to Mount Sinai. And there at Mount Sinai, they're given the 10 Commandments, and they're given Leviticus. In other words, these are my commands. This is how you're going to implement those. These are how you're going to follow those. The sacrificial system, the ark, all this kind of stuff, the tabernacle, all of that is given to them at Mount Sinai. But the book of Leviticus fits into Exodus timeline-wise. Exodus chapter 20, because that's when Moses goes up on the mountain for 40 days. Now, from there, they leave and start heading towards the promised land, the land that God had promised his people from back in Abraham. And they start going towards it. And in the book of Numbers, there was a generation who they went into the land, they saw these guys are really big. And they say, they look like the Nephilim, which you're like, who are the Nephilim? Genesis chapter 6. No one really knows exactly who the Nephilim is. There's been a lot of debate as to who they actually are. That'd be a fun conversation. But the fact is they don't think that they can take these guys. These guys are so big, we're like grasshoppers in their eyes. They're giants. We can't do it. And so they don't believe. And so God says, you don't believe I can get in the promised land? I'm not going to let you in. And for that, and for 40 years, he allows them to wander in the wilderness and waits for that generation to die off. He provides for them, he gives them food, but he waits 40 years for them to die off. And then their children are allowed to go into the land. We'll talk more about that in the meta-narrative video that will follow this. Now, right before they go into the land that God has promised them, or the promised land, we have the book of Deuteronomy. And in the book of Deuteronomy, God is reminding his people of his covenant that he made with them, right back at Mount Sinai. And he's saying, look, I'm your God. I saved you out of Egypt. You should have died there. I love you. I'm going to take care of you. And I completely am going to provide for you. I'm going to be everything. But you got to follow me. You got to walk with me. You got to worship me. You got to do these sacrifices. And so it's a reminder that if you follow me, if you do these things, I will bless you and I will take care of you and provide for you. If you don't, I will get out the stick and start spanking you. And that's God's way of letting his people know, like, this is the covenant. We're in this together. And so they're reminded of Deuteronomy before they go into the promised land. And so that's where we find them in Joshua. And so in Joshua, they go in, they conquer the promised land, and then they begin to take residence within it. But the problem is they didn't exactly finish the conquest. They knocked out all the big guys, and they had a bunch of little guys. And all these little guys, eventually, they sat there and they're like, well, we'll just make them our slaves. I know God, and we're going to talk about that, again, the annihilation part of it. But we'll just make them our slaves, and we won't really finish them off like God said. And so later that led to them being conquered and being overrun because they were no longer following God. They were worshiping these idols and stuff. And so God allows them to be overtaken and then has to send in judges, not guys in robes, men and women in robes that sit behind, sit in courtrooms, but more like generals. And they would rescue the people and restore these tribes, restore the Israelites back to what God intended, restore the land. And that happened multiple times in the book of Judges, including during the book of Ruth. And Ruth happens sometime in Judges. We don't know where, but in Ruth we're talking about in the time when the judges were judging. That's what it says at the beginning of the book. Well, got to be somewhere in there. So that's where Ruth plays in. And then from Ruth, we go on to Samuel. We begin to learn about the kingdom period where we have Saul. Well, we have Samuel, and then Saul, and then David. Saul and David being the first kings. And then subsequently, moving on to Solomon in Kings. Now, some of you are like, well, hold on, isn't it 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings? Yes, you're right. It is 1st and 2nd Samuel. It is 1st and 2nd Kings. But the reason there's 1st and 2nd is because it originally was one book. But it was so large, they couldn't fit on one scroll. So they had to just cut the sucker in half. So that's why we have 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. But the important thing to remember is it's just one book. So in Samuel, we have our kings, and then followed with Solomon afterwards. And then it's in Kings that the kingdom splits. And I'll go into more detail with this later. The northern tribes and the southern. 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin in the south. 10 tribes in the north. All right. These guys follow Solomon's son, Rehoboam. These guys follow Solomon's general, one of his top guys, Jeroboam. And that happens after Solomon's death. And we essentially end up with a civil war. And it's interesting, during the period of that time, as we're seeing this play out, this is when the prophets would come in. And we're going to talk about them here briefly. But the people didn't listen. They didn't follow God. And so God, after a while, says, look, I warned you what would happen if you didn't listen to me. And so he allows the Assyrians to come in right here and wipe them out. And subsequently, many years later, to wipe the Babylonians come in and knock out the southern kingdom. And that's it. And there, guess what? They're taking away into, and let's not jump the gun, they're taken away into exile. And it's while in exile that the people are in Babylon. That's where they're taken. Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, that kind of stuff. They're taken into exile. And we'll go into talking about how the books fit in and that kind of stuff. But then they're allowed by God's grace to return back from exile. And so Ezra comes back and he rebuilds the wall. He doesn't rebuild the wall. That's Nehemiah. Ezra reads the law, brings back the law. The people begin to Zerubbabel rebuilds the temple, and they begin to restore Jerusalem. And then Nehemiah comes back and rebuilds the wall. And that's the end, history-wise, of your Old Testament. Now, what about Esther? Well, Esther was going on at the same time as Nehemiah. These were the Jews that chose to stay behind in Babylon and not go back with these Jews back to home, back to Jerusalem. What's interesting about Esther is that there was a lot of debate. Is this among the Jews whenever they were deciding what is going to be a part of our Hebrew Bible and what isn't? And so in doing this, they began to debate. And the reason they debated Esther was because God's name is never mentioned. How are we going to have a book about God? Why are we going to include this and God's name is never mentioned? Why did they allow it to stay in? Because they began to realize at some point, oh, God's name's not mentioned because these people were living as if God didn't exist. They were living as if, oh, hold on, they weren't listening to God and going back to Jerusalem like these guys were. And so that's why God isn't visibly present in word in the book, but he's present in that he's still taking care of his people and prevents the genocide that Haman wants to happen on them. And so those are your historical books of the Old Testament. Now, some of you are like, well, hold on, you forgot Chronicles. You're exactly right. Chronicles was written during the exile, and it's a history of Judah, the southern kingdom. And so, First Chronicles talks about Samuel. Second Chronicles talks about kings. So in First Chronicles we read about Saul, David, these kind of things. Because again, this is the tribe of Judah. David's in the tribe of Judah. And in Second Chronicles we get more details about the kings in the southern kingdom. The only details we get about the kings of the northern kingdom come in the book of Kings itself. So that's Chronicles, and that's how it fits in. So those are the historical books of your Old Testament. Here's the interesting thing. If I had a student who was going to read, or if I had a person who wanted to read their Old Testament, then here's what I would do. I said, guess what? We're going to start in Genesis. Why don't you read Genesis 1 to 50? And by the way, this is after going over the meta-narrative or the large structure of the Bible. We'd read Genesis 1 to 50. And then we drop into Exodus. And we'd read Exodus 1 to 20. And 32 to 33. And that's it. And some of you are like, whoa, there's other parts of Exodus. You skipped some chapters. Do we really care about a tabernacle? Do we really care about an ark? All right, those are great. They had a point. But I want to keep the plot moving. I don't want them to do what I did and get bogged down in it. And so what do I do then? Skip Leviticus. Just don't worry about it. There's great truth in it. There's some neat nuggets, but it's like trying to walk across Nevada with no water. You're not going to make it in the summertime. So skip Leviticus. Go on into Numbers. 36 chapter book. You only read about 13 chapters. Why? Because there's 13 chapters of narrative within Numbers. Don't worry about the red heifer sacrifice. Don't worry about the numbering of the people. Stay on the plot. Don't worry about Deuteronomy. Some of you are like, whoo, boy, I don't like that book. So, whoo. Moving into Joshua. We read Joshua 1 to 12 and 22 to 24. You're like, well, what about those other deals? Look, if you want to read about the allotments of the tribes and where they put their land and who was there, Go ahead, but I'm trying to keep the plot moving. And then we hit Judges, all of it. Samuel, all of it. Kings, all of it. Don't worry about Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. Done. Now that's a long way to go, but if they start going through that, they will see the whole story and not get bogged down. And then later, when they come back in, they'll know where to put these pieces of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Oh, when reading Judges, you'd want to do Ruth too. They'll know where Chronicles goes. They'll know where to put them in. And it'll make a lot of sense, or at least more sense. And hopefully, too, that's where the meta-narrative thing that I'm going to video after this, you'll look at that and begin to put it all together. But that is the historical books of your Old Testament. Now, what about poetical books? Where do they fit in along this timeline? Well, poetical books. Job. You're like, whoa, Job comes after Esther? Why is he up in Genesis? Well, Job has a handful, just a few chapters of narrative, 2 at the beginning, 1 in the end. And in the beginning of Job, we learned that his kids had a wild party, and Job was like, I don't know what they did. They may not remember what they did, but I'll go offer a sacrifice for their sins, just in case they did some things they shouldn't. And it's a sacrifice. Now, it's not the same kind of sacrifice that God instituted in the Mosaic covenant at Mount Sinai. So we know he's not after this period. And he's more than likely, so he's got to be before that, and he's more than likely after Noah, because again, God judges the whole earth. So sometime between Noah and Moses is Job, and that's where he fits in. But again, he's down here, numbers-wise in the book, because when you read after Esther, because the Old Testament is organized according to genre. What about Psalms? Well, Psalms is primarily written by David. And so that's going to occur in Samuel. All right, got it here on the card. And so that's going to happen there. Tradition is held that Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon is written by Solomon. Proverbs being, Song of Solomon being Solomon in his youth. Proverbs, Solomon in midlife. Ecclesiastes, Solomon at the end of life. Interestingly enough, all of these books were debated as to whether, the Hebrews debated as to whether they should include them. Proverbs, because of a contradiction. Why? Because it says, don't answer a fool according to his folly. Next one, answer a fool according to his folly. And they're like, well, hold on. The Bible seems to be disagreeing here. It's telling me to answer one, but not to answer one. Why did they choose to include it? Because they realized, situational. There's sometimes when I talk to a moron, and there's sometimes when I don't. Just depends on the situation. Does he have a little too much to drink? May not be the time. If he's a little bit more in his right mind and wants to listen, maybe then I can speak to him. Ecclesiastes is too dark. It's depressing. I love Ecclesiastes. But it is. It's a dark book. Scares some folks. And so they're like, this is too depressing. I don't know if it should be there. So if you've ever read Ecclesiastes, you're like, this is a depressing book. Well, guess what? The Jews felt the same way. But why did they keep it? Because it's true. That's the thing. Ecclesiastes really is true to life. And then finally, Song of Solomon. Why did they almost can it? Because it might actually mean what it says. It's racy. And it is graphic in the sexual sense. And, oh my gosh, we can't have that there. But no, God's saying, no, 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 no. Very important. This is me. I made sex. I made love. I want you guys to see how much a man loves his woman. And so we have Song of Solomon. Now, that is your poetical literature. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. That's where they fit in. Now, prophetical. Everybody's favorite section. I know people are like, woo, boy, give me some Isaiah. I just love me some Joel. Yeah, right. I actually have come to really like the prophets. But it has been once I understand who they are and what they're trying to communicate. The role of the prophet was to point the people back to God. All right? And nearly all your prophetical literature is going to happen right here in Kings. And it's going to happen a little bit in the exile. And it's going to conclude here. And what was their role? Their role was to point the people back to God, to point the people back to the covenantal relationship that God made with them in Mount Sinai and reconfirm with them in the book of Deuteronomy and say, look, he loves you. He gave himself for you in the sense that he rescued you from Egypt. You were in slavery. You should have died. He saved you. And he's going to take care of you. Not Baal, not Dagon, not Molech, not Chemosh. None of these other gods are going to save you. Only Yahweh is. And yet the people did not listen. And so throughout the king period, they keep talking to these people and they keep trying to reel them back in and saying, come on, follow God, follow God. And some of you have read Isaiah or Jeremiah or these guys. And you're sitting here saying, whoo, yeah, but their language is really hard. It is. And it sounds like some kind of crazy campus evangelist. You know, you're going to burn, oh, I'm going to, you know, and it's graphic language. I mean, Hosea, I'm going to rip off your skirt and expose your genitals to the wind. It's like, whoa, what do I do with it? Jesus loves me. Oh, Jesus loves me. And I say that because my wife, a few years back, was doing a Bible study with her girls' Bible study, her college girls. She said, I want to do Hosea. And I said, I think that's great. But you need to know something. She's like, what? I was like, Old Testament book. That's going to spook them a little bit. Prophet. That's going to spook them a little bit. Like, what do we do? These are the stuck together pages of our Bible. And not just prophet, a minor prophet. One of those little guys. I mean, still Isaiah or Jeremiah were like, oh, these are big enough. I should probably read them. And he's going to use graphic language. What are you going to do when he uses that kind of language? Because again, we have a hard time with that. Why? Because we're like, but that's not gracious. It's not nice. Well, guess what? God had been patient and gracious all these years, and they weren't listening to patient and gracious. And so again, Q Alice Cooper, no more Mr. Nice Guy. And God says, guess what? You won't listen to me nice? I'm going to put it to you in hard terms. I'm going to cut it straight to you and see if you listen. And the people didn't. All right? As I have here too on the card, God sent a handful of prophets to the north. Nobody listened to them. And so what did God allow to happen? He allowed the Assyrians to come in and take them out. And they were completely wiped off. Interestingly enough, God cared enough about the Assyrians that he sent them a prophet. Who? Jonah. Jonah didn't want to go to the Assyrians. He hated the Assyrians. Couldn't stand them. It would be like, to put it this way, because again, he knew about all the destruction they were doing. It would be like sending a Jew into Berlin in 1942 and saying, evangelize these people. Lead them to the Lord. No. And so there's that hatred as he goes back and forth with God. And he's like, I don't want to help these people. So God cares enough about the Assyrians to send them Jonah. And guess what? They repent. That's where Nineveh was. It was one of the key cities in Assyria. And they repent. And then later God sends them Zephaniah to get them to listen more. Okay? And so, anyway, that's where the Assyrians, that's where they pop in. And then, all right, he sends other guys to the south. Isaiah, Jeremiah. In fact, Jeremiah is completely not listened to. And he says, guess what? God's going to bring the stick. And sure enough, God does with the Babylonians. And Jeremiah is left to watch the destruction of Jerusalem. And he's there. And unlike Ezekiel and Daniel, who were taken off in exile to Babylon, Jeremiah's kind of old. You know, they didn't take old guys to Babylon. We can't do much with you. We took the young guys, the young talented guys. Take Ezekiel, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. He's left to watch the destruction of Jerusalem. And he laments the destruction of Jerusalem. Hence the book of what? Lamentations, where he's lamenting. And so then they're taken to exile, and then he gives this, I love this, the exilic prophets. You've got Ezekiel and Daniel, prophets of the exile. And that's where they are. That's where they fit in. So there is some historical. We do have some, I keep using historical, we do have some narrative during that period when you read the book of Daniel. Okay? And then God brings them back. And then he has a handful of prophets here during the Ezra and Nehemiah period, such as Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. And Malachi is your last one. And he says, all right, guys, you know what? You've got to stay faithful to God. You've rebuilt the wall. Great. You've got the temple up and running. Great. But you're offering three-legged lambs and cancerous bulls. That's not your best. Do you want to go back to exile like your forefathers? No, no, no. I want you to trust God. Give God your best. Because guess what? I know this kingdom doesn't look like the way you thought it did. I know you thought, we're going to go back to Jerusalem. It's going to be awesome party. Back to David time. And it wasn't. And the people are bitter. And they're like, what's the deal, God? Thought you said things were going to be great. They're not great right now. And Malachi says, guess what? You're not giving God your best. You've got to test him. Let's give God our best. And he's going to send someone. He's going to send this guy who's going to lead the way for the guy. By the way, this guy, John the Baptist, who's going to lead the way for the guy, Jesus. And this idea of this Messiah, this Savior, this Redeemer, along the lines of someone like David, this who would restore the nation, this was taking root during the exile and subsequently here. And so these people are like, when is he? And Malachi's like, he's coming. He's coming. Now we're going to move on to the New Testament. The thing you have to understand about the New Testament is whereas the Old Testament spanned a period of over 2,500 years, the New Testament is a period of less than 100 years. Now, like the Old Testament, the New Testament breaks down into three different areas, and you may remember them from earlier. The historical books, which contain history, and then the epistles, which is a fancy word again for letters. And of those epistles, you have those that are Pauline, written by Paul, and those that are general. Okay? Now, in your historical books, you have 5. You've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. With Acts, or the Acts of the Apostles, having also been written by Luke. 2-part series. And so that is your historical books of your New Testament. When we have these 4 Gospels or stories about the life of Jesus, and then subsequently what happened after Jesus ascended into heaven. All right? And that's how you get the book of Acts. Well, the interesting thing is, too, as you look at this, you're like, okay, I'm familiar with this. This is nothing new. But some of you may have heard of this term. When you look at these books, Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a lot in common. And they're known as the synoptics. Now, the synoptic books are interesting in that they share a lot of stories. They share a lot of similarities about them. Matthew, Mark, and Luke share a large amount of their content, to the point where even scholars begin to wrestle and wonder, okay, did one borrow from another? Was one book sourced from another? Was Mark the earliest, and then Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source? There's a lot of debate as to what, but we know this. They do have a great deal in common. If tradition holds true, then Matthew, the Apostle Matthew, wrote Matthew. That John Mark wrote Mark, and that Peter was his primary source. And then Luke, who was a doctor, was the writer of both Luke and Acts. And then finally, the Apostle John writes John. Now, you may notice that the synoptics include Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but John is here on its own. And why? Because John is a completely different animal. If Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if Jesus is a building, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are looking right at it. They're just looking at the base of the building, looking up like a skyscraper, just going, there he is. Okay? John is on a whole nother building, looking down at that building from a side angle. Okay? So he's got a completely different perspective. And what John wants to do is he wants to smack you over the head right off the bat and let you know that Jesus was God. Jesus is God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's how he starts his book. And for the rest of the book, he's hitting you and going, did you know Jesus is God? Hey, did you know Jesus is God? Hey, guess what? Jesus is God. And we get some of the strongest verses, the strongest references to Jesus' deity. That being, the highest of those being John 8:58, where Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. The Jews then picked up rocks to stone him. Why? Because when he said I am, he said Yahweh. That's the same name that God told Moses back in Exodus chapter 3. Whenever Moses was like, who should I tell him sent me? And he says, tell him Yahweh. Not just a God, not just anything. Yahweh, I am. And so when Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am, he's attributing deity to himself. The Jews knew exactly what he said. And that's why they picked up rocks to stone him, because in their mind there was nothing more blasphemous than that. And so John is trying to club you all over the head with letting you know that Jesus is God. Not that these other three guys don't care about that. They do. But John is written from a completely different vantage point. And so, those are your four Gospels right there. And then followed with that is the book of Acts. And this summarizes that of the early church, where, again, the 11 disciples are left as Judas has hung himself. They elect a 12th disciple. And then they begin essentially the church. And we see how the gospel grows from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the ends of the earth. Going back to Acts 1:8, where Jesus tells them and says, go what? I want you to spread the gospel out from there. And so that's what happens. It begins to grow. And it's in, of course, Acts that we come across Paul. And in that, Paul writes his letters. Okay? All his letters are usually written during the time of the book of Acts. All right? And if we look at his letters, of the Pauline letters, we've got his letters to churches and his letters to individuals. So even within the category of Pauline epistles or Pauline letters, there is a subcategory. The letters to churches. Church of Rome, Corinth, Ephesus, Galatia. You just go down the list. Colossae, Thessalonica, Philippi, where Paul is writing letters to them and communicating to them as he's on his missionary journeys and as he has started these churches and is desiring to encourage them. And so we've got Paul's letters to churches. And then we have Paul's letters to individuals. He writes 2 to Timothy, he writes 1 to Titus, and another to Philemon. And again, there's been a lot of debate as to when these were written. More than likely, these were written after the book of Acts, because the book of Acts closes and Paul's still alive. And tradition holds that Paul was killed by the Romans, in fact, killed by the Emperor Nero. Nero's not the emperor at that time. And so the book of Acts finishes up before 70 AD. And so more than likely, Paul finished his imprisonment in Rome, was free for a while, and then was imprisoned again by Nero and subsequently killed. And so it's probably during that time that Paul wrote these books to individuals. Finally, you have your general epistles, your general letters. And while they had an intended audience, for example, the book of Hebrews was written to Christians who had a Jewish background. Peter wrote 1 Peter, again, you heard me mention it earlier, to the churches in what in Asia Minor are now known as Turkey. And so it wasn't just one specific church, it would be an area of churches. And so these would be passed around. James, Hebrews, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Jude, and then Revelation. Now, Revelation is its own interesting book within that because it's what's known as apocalyptic literature. Apa being last, the Greek word for last, talking about the last days. What is going to happen whenever Christ returns? Because he makes that point in all 4 of the Gospels during his time on earth. Someday I will return. John chapter 3, verse 17, where it says, "For the Son of God did not come to the world to judge the world, but to save it." That didn't mean that Jesus just winked at sin and said, "Hey, no big deal, you got a sin, all right, I don't care." No, he came to save the world. And then he was going to come back to judge the world in that final judgment. And that's what Revelation is speaking about. So that's why it's called apocalyptic literature. In other words, the last the last days. And so that basically rounds up your Old Testament. And so, rounds up your New Testament. So you might again remember, the Old Testament, period of over 2,500 years, had the categories of historical books, poetical books, and prophetical books. Your New Testament, much more simple. You've got your historical books and then your epistles, your Pauline epistles and your general epistles. And so even within that, all of these books were either written during the time of the book of Acts or shortly afterwards. And so that wraps up basically our summary of the Old and New Testament books. By the way, one thing that just skipped my mind, and I might as well tell it to you right now. Whenever I was talking about the prophets, and this happens, by the way, when you teach, you're like, oh, I forgot something. But whenever I was talking about the prophets in the Old Testament, some of you might have heard the Old Testament prophets being talked about as major prophets and minor prophets. Why do we call them that? Well, because major prophets, incidentally, it didn't mean that Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel were somehow better prophets than Amos or Joel or Haggai. It was just that their books were longer. If you look at it, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel are massive texts, massive ones, in comparison with Joel, say for instance, it's just a handful of chapters. In comparison with Jonah, that's just 3 chapters. Habakkuk, Jonah's 4 chapters, Habakkuk is 3. And so your major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, because Isaiah writes that, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Again, this doesn't mean that their books are somehow more important than the others. It was mainly speaking to size. And then finally, your minor prophets are known as the Book of the 10. And that's your other guys like Habakkuk, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. All those fit into there. Amos, Joel, Obadiah. Those are your minor prophets. And so I just want to throw that in so you had some understanding on that. But again, this is just the simple basics. Again, if we can teach our people, if we can teach the people we interact with how our Bible is put together, they will begin to make sense of it and say, that's the story. I never connected it. We've got to give our folks a fighting chance. And so that's why this is just the simplest of lessons. By the way, if you want a great textbook to use or a great resource to walk people through this, Max Anders' 30 Days to Understanding the Bible is excellent. We use it all the time with people. I still see it as the best practical tool out there for teaching this and then the general storyline of the Bible. If Max didn't make it, I would have created it. He did such a good job, there was no point in reinventing the wheel. So don't forget to check that out as well. Thank you for your time. I'll see you here in a little bit on the next video where I'll begin to break down the meta-narrative or the larger story of the Bible.